This morning, I wanted to talk about how Unitarian Universalism relates to Christianity for a few different reasons. The most obvious reason is the giant cross behind me. For months, we will be worshiping here as guests at St. George's Episcopal Church. And since we first started conversations about using this space, the leadership of St. George's has been very clear that they see us not as renters, but as guests here. Their hospitality and our shared values are a reminder of the goodness of our Christian neighbors today and of our Christian roots as Unitarian Universalists. The second reason for understanding our relationship with Christianity is about context. We live in a largely Christian country. We've had 45 presidents of the United States, each one of them some variety of Christian. Each one has also been male, but that is a different sermon. As Unitarian Universalists in a Christian-dominated country, we occupy a sort of religious gray zone in between the center and the periphery. We share a history and some Christian elements, but we are not a Christian denomination today. We're in between. And if we understand that position, we can use it strategically to build bridges and shift power in some pretty interesting ways. Now, the third and most important reason that I want to talk about our relationship with Christianity is that most Unitarian Universalist converts, most of you, come out of a Christian background. Making that transition usually comes with a combination of baggage and resources. The helpful parts of your Christian past, the resources, are still rightfully yours to claim. If we deal with some of the baggage effectively, the resources of our religious past, Christian or otherwise, can be more effectively called upon in our lives. So today is just a glimpse of how we as a faith tradition relate to Christianity. I want to invite you to do something thinking of how you personally relate to it. Given the role that Christianity plays in our country and possibly in your own history, it's worth considering in a little more depth than the basic belief or disbelief. So in case you didn't know, Unitarian Universalism is a very bad name for our faith tradition. It's not very catchy, and even worse, it does a bad job of describing who we are. Unitarianism and Universalism are both Christian theological ideas. They emerged as reform movements within Christianity. But over the past 2 centuries, they evolved into something much broader than our Christian roots. So to understand that reform movement, it's helpful to have a snapshot of Christianity in the 18th and 19th centuries America. Back then, Christians generally believed that we were totally reliant on God for having any goodness in us at all. We were so sinful as humans that the only way that we could find faith or salvation was through God's choice. And any attempts to use reason to find our way would only lead us away from God and toward the sin of pride. I know, it's harsh. In the midst of that focus on predestination and fear, some liberal Christians began to see a different story in their Bibles, and a controversy started to brew, and it's actually called the Unitarian controversy. That's how we name this moment in history. In the early 1800s, a split was emerging in the academic theology world, and clergy were also sort of being drawn into two very different camps. Some were beginning to read their Bible with historical criticism and to dig a little deeper. Eventually, those liberal Christians became known as Unitarians. Now, the word means someone who believes that God is of a single nature, not part of a Trinity. That idea came out of reading the Bible, and it's actually something that has bubbled up over and over in the whole history of Christianity. For obvious reasons, it was a blasphemous idea to most Christians at the time. For those earliest Unitarians, though, it was only a small theological detail to a much bigger question of how we would exercise our faith. In 1818, William Ellery Channing preached the sermon, Unitarian Christianity, where he sort of set the trajectory for a different way of being Christian, a way that would become us. That sermon had 2 points. First, he insisted that we should use reason to develop our faith. After all, it was a gift, this great capacity of critical thought. And second, he said that we humans are capable of moral development. Our salvation was not simply up to the whim of a vengeful God. We could improve ourselves. What's more, we should improve ourselves, and that should be the focus of religious life. He said that yes, we reject the Trinity, but more importantly, we believe that we should apply reason to our religious lives. And that reason could be a great resource for moral development. I don't have time to go into the details, but he argued these ideas out of biblical interpretation. These weren't random thoughts that he had. This was a very Christian conversation. And what he started was not intended to be a different religion. It was started as a reform movement. Now, Universalism has a slightly different history. It also began as a reform movement, though. The person who's probably most responsible for Universalism in America came up with the idea in England in 1750. His name was James Relly. And he came up with universal salvation in a way that I always think is fascinating because we think of it very differently today. He thought to himself, I can be a pretty lousy person. I sin all the time, yet I have this relationship with God, and I feel like God wouldn't punish me for eternal damnation. And if God would spare me, well, then certainly he would spare everyone else. So, like Unitarianism, Universalism was viewed as a radical, even heretical version of Christianity. James Murray was one of those English Universalists who fled to the United States to start a new life where it was a little bit safer, and that's largely who's responsible for Universalism here in the US. So by the 1850s, Unitarians and Universalists separately, both challenged Orthodox Christianity. They both believed in a loving God that wanted all people to grow in wisdom and in character. They believed that we had the capacity and the responsibility to utilize reason and compassion. And almost all of them saw themselves as Christian. They were slowly growing groups, but a new voice among Unitarians began to define the separation much more strongly. In the mid-1800s, Theodore Parker led the largest church in Boston at the time. Every week, 3,000 people would come into the auditorium to hear him preach. Now, there was clearly an audience for his message, but his message was so controversial that all of his Unitarian colleagues kept a long distance from him. They didn't want to be fully associated with his radical message. So in 1841, he preached a sermon that I think sort of outlined the trajectory of how we became who we are. It's called "The Transient and the Permanent in Christianity." He argued that the core of Christianity, the permanent part, was a message of loving one another and loving God. It's that simple. All the rest is extra. All the rest is transient and impermanent. It will melt away. So in this sermon, he names the transient things, the extra things. He talks at length about the Bible, pointing out that the document contradicts itself. He says you don't need any great analysis beyond the fact that it contradicts itself to see that it is not perfect. Parker said, since the Bible is not a perfect account and clearly is not the perfect word of God, it doesn't have the strength to sustain the permanent message of Christianity. Then he moved on to theology to talk about how impermanent it was. He talks about the unfolding of church doctrine over time and how the things that stood as right in one era were considered blasphemous in another. How then could theological doctrine be the permanent truth? And after unseating the Bible and theology, he let fly the biggest whammy of his sermon. Theodore Parker wrote, "So if it could be proved that the Gospels were the fabrication of designing and artful men, that Jesus of Nazareth had never lived, still Christianity would stand firm and fear no evil." For Parker, there was a core truth to Christianity, a truth so deep that it didn't even need the person of Jesus. The Bible and all those pages of theology and even the person of Jesus himself were all add-ons to the core of Christianity. According to Parker, that core was the life that Jesus led, not the beliefs he held. The core of the message is about right living, not right belief. Parker described it as a trinity of wisdom, love, and piety. Let those be our holy trinity, he says. To some, Theodore Parker is known as a brilliant theologian, and to others he's known as an activist. Beyond just speaking out against slavery, Parker housed people on the Underground Railroad and notoriously kept a loaded gun in his desk drawer to defend such people. He also raised funds for Brown's Rebellion. He risked his own life for his ministry to defend the most vulnerable human beings of his time. He said that the most important thing in religious life is our relationship with one another and with the sacred. The end of Christianity seems to be to make all men one with God, as Christ was one with God, Parker says. The particular duties it enjoins are humility, reverence, sobriety, gentleness, forgiveness, and active love. This isn't a sit around and enjoy the friendly vibes kind of love. This is a go out there, build the beloved community, and change the world kind of love. We believe today, as Unitarian Universalists, that we are called to build beloved community in the world. So where does all this place us in relationship to Christianity today? I think most of all what I want you to hear from this sermon and this history as that we've been a gradual growth out of Christianity, not a rejection of it. Today, Christianity is incredibly diverse. You may not realize it, but we are strikingly similar to liberal Christians. Members of the United Church of Christ, the short acronym is UCC, they jokingly call themselves Unitarians considering Christ. They are our allies and our friends. Unitarianism and Universalism were not the only Christian reform movements. Many wise women and men brought the church forward by staying with it. Today, many liberal Christians agree with our Unitarian Universalist predecessors. They too realize that any God worth our attention is too compassionate to condemn people to eternal punishment. They too understand that reason is a gift that we should use to deepen our faith and understand our world. Now, some of you are undoubtedly thinking, yes, those are the liberal Christians. We may be similar to them, but what about the rest? It's no secret that Christianity has been used to further an agenda of fear and hatred. For almost 2,000 years, racist, sexist, homophobic, and generally hateful leaders have slapped the label of Christianity onto their agenda and called their hatred holy. We Unitarian Universalists categorically reject that kind of hatred. We must remember, though, that Christianity is not the only religion or philosophy to have fallen prey to such a fate. Bigots have also used the banner of Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, and Buddhism to disguise their hatred as a noble cause. And if we know our history of oppression well, we must admit that science, too, has been wielded as a deadly tool of bigotry, defining some humans as categorically different and less valuable. We reject hatred that masquerades as religion, in whatever form it takes. And we steadfastly stand beside the good people of all faiths that usher in beloved community by fostering love, compassion, and justice among all people. It just so happens that our Christian siblings here at St. George's and around the world are some of those good people. So in closing, I want to repeat my invitation that I made to you earlier. I've spoken about how we institutionally relate to Christianity. It's time for you to think of how you relate to it as an individual. Given the role of Christianity in our country and possibly in your own history, it's worth considering your relationship with Christianity beyond the simple black and white of belief or disbelief. Amen.